Hey folks, here we are for the second video on mechanical fuel injection. I'm going to try and speed this one up a little bit because the last video kind of seemed a little bit excessive at nearly an hour long. I just didn't want to skimp out on giving you guys any of the basic information. So in the last video, we covered, fuel cell, fuel pump, the injector hat itself, nozzles and lines, barrel valve and butterflies, and the basic initial settings for those two. So this video here, I'm going to go to what would be the next step. So the way the hat and all the injection was set up in the last video, all the fuel was going in through the hat. And that is a combination that is probably really super common for everything up to, I would say, roughly about 1,300, 1,500 horsepower. Now, what is the next step when you move on beyond that power level, or you go to a blower that is more capable than that power level? There are a couple of components that you can add to this system which might make it more capable or maybe more tunable. So we'll look at that because that's actually what I'm going to do on this truck. Now, I kind of feel like I keep referring to there being a problem with this setup, and that is because I'm getting a temperature difference front to back. As I mentioned in the last video, this thing could probably go out and make a full throttle pass and run fine and make great power. It just bothers me that I'm getting, on the pyrometer in the truck, I'm getting nearly 900 degrees, up to 900 degrees on the front cylinders, while the back cylinders are clear down around maybe 350, 300. So there's a huge variance in the temperature front to back, and this is only at idle. I haven't gone out and driven the truck and really put it under power to see if that levels out. It could plane out and work out really well. I would assume that would be how it works. But at idle, I would like to see that thing cleaned up. When I jump on the throttle, I would like to have those temperatures between the front and the back of the engine to be much closer. So that's what I'm going to try and correct. I'm going to go ahead and grab the camera, take you over here to the engine, and look at some of the parts that I've already added back into this system. We'll talk about what is the benefits of adding some of these parts, when you might go ahead and look into adding this part to the system, and what my expectations are by me making this change to this particular combination. Now, after doing some research and talking to a couple of people, I really feel like the issue that I have going on is the air is coming in the blower here, and it's basically the way the rotors are shaped, and as they kind of close up and open, they're rolling around in the case like this. The last place that they're open is right up here, and then the first place that they discharge out the bottom of the blower is clear back here. So I really think what's going on is the air is just kind of flowing this way in the blower, and it's taking the fuel with it. As you can see here, I've already tried to make a minor change here just to see, just kind of an experiment. I removed this nozzle holder and this line. And I've kind of basically made very minor change with the nozzles here and moved all of my fuel discharging into the blower here clear to the front. And it made virtually no difference in my pyrometer temperatures front to back. So that's just telling me that basically the fuel is just migrating this way in the blower, and probably under a vacuum, it's just falling into the back of this manifold. And these two back cylinders on each side are getting the vast majority of the fuel. Now, like I said, under boost, when this thing is on the throttle, you got the throttle blades open, the blower can pull all the air in it needs. It's moving that air into the manifold and creating a boost pressure in the manifold. The way it distributes fuel could be totally different. It could be cramming that fuel and air in the back and dispersing it throughout the manifold and just level out and run beautifully. I'm not really certain on that part. But I'm really just looking to correct my issue at idle. Now, I have seen guys that are running, like I'd mentioned, a front discharge or a delta opening blower, where the only place for that air to discharge out of the blower is right here at the front of the case. And to deal with the, kind of a similar issue that I'm having, guys will move the blower back on the manifold As a matter of fact, the 547 with the big 1471 on it, the blower is actually moved back on the manifold 2.5 inches with what they call a setback plate. Now that obviously is not going to help me because all of my fuel is being dumped at the back of the manifold as it is right now anyway. I've also seen where guys will put what they call a shoe inside of the manifold. So it's right underneath that discharge port or that opening in the bottom of the blower. And as that air and fuel is coming out of the blower, this shoe, they call it, kind of just scoops the air and kind of redirects towards the back. So it's trying to level out that airflow or that boost pressure and fuel in the manifold, kind of get a little bit better distribution. Now, another thing, you've exceeded the power level of putting all of your fuel through the hat, or you have a front discharge blower and everything is coming out of the blower in one small location in the manifold. You might need to change your fuel distribution throughout the engine, and the best way to do that is to be able to tune each individual cylinder. And that is where you have port nozzles. If you remember back in one of my previous videos, when I powder coated the manifold, prior to powder coating it, I had drilled and tapped each runner for a port nozzle. And I'd even installed the nozzle holders with the intentions of possibly having to add this back into the system. So here we are. The port nozzles themselves are very, very similar to what's up here in the hat. The biggest difference, as I had mentioned in the last video, the hat nozzle holders have an emulsion hole. These nozzle holders do not have that hole. Obviously, you do not want to be pushing boost out of each one of your runners as your blower speeds up and you start creating boost in the manifold. You don't want to leak that out of your holders. So these nozzle holders do not have any emulsification holes in them. Outside of that, they're pretty much the same. Obviously rubber lines instead of stainless steel lines, and that just makes it easier to deal with stuff, you know, when you got your rocker arms off or you're doing any kind of maintenance on it. Now your port line, your port nozzles are fed from these rubber hoses, which come from a distribution block, which this distribution block is exactly the same as the one on the back of the hat. This distribution block is mounted on here upside down, and then there's a check valve here. You can see I have it marked at 13 psi. This is just another poppet, kind of like your idle poppet, but this one I have set at 13 psi. Now this port poppet and port distribution block are fed by this number 8 hose, which comes off the bottom of the barrel valve. This port right here and the port that feeds the hat nozzles are in the same cavity. So it's getting fuel inlet and it's getting fuel from the same area. The big difference is at idle, you're at 5 psi, so it's feeding fuel to the hat nozzles. But this one here is stopped at that point because that is a 13 psi poppet. At 5 psi, that is not going to open and it's not going to let fuel through these hoses. So this is basically when you come off of idle, the system's going to ramp up. When it makes 13 psi, it's going to start filling that block and these hoses and distributing fuel into each individual runner. And each one of those is tunable by changing the nozzle in each runner. So under power, if you're a little bit lean up here on the front because all the air's coming out of the blower up here, so you're getting a little more boost in this runner, and you need a little more fuel, you can actually change that nozzle and richen it up or give it a little bit more fuel. Now, with all of that said, why did I add these lines if this doesn't do anything at idle? Clearly there's no fuel going in there at idle. Well, I didn't really add them just for idle. I decided that I wanted to be able to tune each cylinder under power. But this is going to come in handy a little bit later on when I try to cure my fuel distribution problem at idle. Now, while we're here and we're on the topic of fuel ramping up and changing pressure throughout the RPM range, that's typically what happens with this system. It's basically just linear. So as the pump starts making more flow and increasing pressure throughout the system, you know, as the RPM increases, it moves more fuel, creates more flow. It can get to the point that it's actually it's moving too much fuel. It cannot return enough fuel. It's putting too much fuel in the engine, and you need to get more fuel back to the tank. This typically happens at higher RPM, higher pressures. So they also have something that you can add to the system that is called a high-speed lean-out or a high-speed bypass. And that is another poppet. Basically, it's just another poppet that has a place to put another pill. And it can go just about anywhere in the system. In the feed line, it can go in the port line, it can go in your hat feed line. I've seen it in all three of those different locations. And all it's going to do is when it gets to that RPM and that pressure, that it is actually starting to make the engine run too rich. That pressure, you have to figure out what that pressure is, and that's what this poppet would be set at. So let's say you start getting up to, say, 7,500 RPM. The fuel pressure's at 160 PSI, and it's just starting to get too rich. It's moving too much fuel. You'd set your poppet that you have in one of these lines at 160 PSI, and you'd get a combination or figure out a jet area for that pill that you're going to put in this bypass. And when it reaches that 160 PSI, it's going to start bypassing that amount of fuel back to the tank, allowing it to dump more or leak more fuel away from the engine. Messing with the high-speed bypass is definitely no joke. If you're gonna do it, I would definitely have a good data logging system, and I would sneak up on it from the rich side for sure. Personally, I don't think I will need that on this particular engine just because it's not gonna spend prolonged amounts of time at higher RPM. But if I prove myself wrong and this thing ends up frickin' on the floor all the time, I might end up looking into that. But it's definitely not a concern this week. Now to the secondary reason that I actually reinstalled these port nozzle lines. So I have seen and heard from guys that talk about dribblers. And what dribblers are is they just add another nozzle to their hot cylinders. It's fairly common on a screw blower, which is a kind of a different type of supercharger altogether. But those guys use it for almost like an intermediate circuit where they come off of idle and they're staging at the starting line. They have dribblers in there to start balancing out the cylinders as they stage to leave the line. But I've also heard of the high helix delta opening guys doing it to level out their cylinders at idle, much like I'm going to do. So that's what we're going to do, is try and build a dribbler system using stuff that I have kicking around here. Now, everything that I've seen as far as guys adding dribblers to their system usually have a dual nozzle holder that would be set up something similar to this. So you'd have your main nozzle coming in, and this would be for tuning your power, say at wide open throttle. You'd have this nozzle for that cylinder. Then they add a small nozzle in here, and all it's doing is feeding in at idle. And this would be run off of your hat, a port off of your hat distribution block. This would come off of that 13 PSI block on the back of the engine. Now, when you do that, you have to figure in the difference in the jet area. You can't just add more fuel to something that you have tuned here. So by adding this second nozzle, this second line, you have to figure out all the math and figure out all the jet area and the additional fuel and everything. So I thought maybe I would try something a little bit different in my combination. I bought a couple of these. I guess you would just call it like a port adapter or a gauge adapter. So it's female 3AN here, male 3AN here, which is the same thread as your nozzles. And then this was an 1/8 inch pipe port. So you could thread a gauge in there or a hose to go to a gauge or something along those lines. I went ahead and adapted these down. I threaded a pipe plug in there, Loctited it, threaded it in there, and then drilled and tapped that plug that I put in there so that a nozzle will fit in that port location. So now I can tee another line in, and I can hook my other hose here. So let's say this is my nozzle holder in the manifold. I already have it set up with my nozzles that are currently in there right now. I have a hose hooked up to it that we just looked at. Take that hose off. We install this setup here. Now clearly this is going to be my dribbler fitting. So it's going to be a very small orifice in this particular nozzle. It's going to be much smaller than the orifice that is in the nozzle holder in the manifold. So this fuel going through here is not going to be restricted by this particular nozzle. The problem that I'm foreseeing, that I'm trying to work out in my head right now, is I do not want this fuel backing up into this line and going back to that distribution block on the back of the engine, filling that block up and then starting to dribble fuel throughout the whole engine. I just want to dribble fuel into the cylinders that I put this setup on. So what I think I'm going to do is end up building a second distribution block for the back of the engine. So this will actually be a third distribution block. And then I'll set it up with another check valve. And then I'll move these lines that will be on this fitting to that particular distribution block. So what will happen is the main feed line off the back of the barrel valve, or the bottom of the barrel valve, that feeds the 13 psi poppet and the port distribution block will then feed through this check valve to the distribution block that is going to go to these fittings here. And all that's going to do is, if this tries to back these hoses up, this will actually work as a check valve and stop that fuel before it starts going into the cylinders that I don't want dribbling fuel to get into. And if this seems a little bit confusing right now, I think it'll be a lot easier to explain once I actually start running hoses and getting parts mounted. So bear with me a little bit. I really hope we can sort it out and have it all make sense before I'm done with this deal.
6.5 hours later.
Well, I got everything added onto this system and a little bit of testing done. So now I figured I would bring you guys in and show you what I'd actually added to the system and how I addressed some of the concerns that I had making these additions. So we'll start right here at the port nozzles. As I had shown you earlier, I had bought these little T fittings and made it so I could add a port or a nozzle to that fitting. And the way these are installed is they are the female side of the 3AN on this T fitting is threaded directly onto the nozzle that is in the nozzle holder in this port. So this nozzle would be where you tune for full throttle, full power. You know, if this cylinder is running rich or lean, you would change this nozzle down here accordingly. Now this T fitting fits on there, and then this hose right here is what would normally feed that nozzle. Now here we have the small nozzle, my dribbler nozzle, and the associated hose that would feed that fuel for at idle. Now I've done the front 2 cylinders on each side of the engine, so 4 cylinders total. These 2 hoses right here, if we follow them up and back, they are run off of the hat distribution block. So this is the distribution block that gets fuel at idle through the barrel valve, through this line right here. Don't mind my T-fitting up here. That's just kind of a proof of concept part that I slapped together real quick so I could get fuel down to all 4 nozzles. There's one here and one down here on this fitting that I'm not using that would have been in this port. And the same on the other side. I'm going to fix this deal. I've got a 12 port block coming from Good Vibrations, so I can actually remove this whole mess, replace it with a distribution block that has 12 ports instead of 8, and that will give me plenty of places to hook all these hoses up and not have this jerry-rigged mess up here. So these 2 hoses are feeding my dribblers in these 2 cylinders. Now, my concern was this fuel coming in here, it's going to come through these little bitty nozzles, and you would hope that the fuel would go down through these nozzles into the cylinder. However, the path of least resistance is back up the hose. And these hoses originally were hooked into the port nozzle distribution block. Now, if the path of least resistance is back through here, back with these rear port nozzle hoses to this block, eventually it would just fill that block and begin drizzling fuel in all 8 cylinders. And that completely defeats the purpose of what I'm trying to achieve here. So what I did was rerouted these hoses, these port nozzle hoses, up here to a new homemade distribution block here. And in this distribution block, I have a check valve and a feed hose from the original port distribution block down here. So the way the system works, if in fact my drizzlers backfill these hoses, it's going to come up here, fill this block, and this check valve will stop fuel from going anywhere past that. So if it's not already going into the manifold, it will go into the manifold once those lines are full. That should get us some control on the idle side. Now, when we go anywhere, you know, say just off idle, and we open into that larger window of the spool, or even as far as wide open throttle, we're going to see more volume, which is going to create more pressure and pop off. This poppet, once we get past the 13 psi, that's going to feed this port distribution block and also this line, and through the check valve, because fuel can flow this way, and feed these port hoses, which are feeding these front nozzles. So that part of the system will work as originally intended. It just has to go through one more block up here for the front 4 cylinders, the front 2 on each side. Now, once all of this was complete, I went ahead and fired up the truck. I made no adjustment to the barrel valve. I didn't touch any of that. We just started it up as is, and immediately noticed a very large difference in cylinder temperatures across the board. So as expected, we dropped temperature in the front 2 cylinders. I started off with a 14 thousandths dribbler nozzle here and a 15 thousandths drizzler nozzle here, and that was the same side to side. Right off the bat, we lost a couple hundred degrees of temperature on the front cylinders, and we actually picked up temperature on the back cylinders. So keep in mind, we are adding fuel to the front cylinders, but we're not adding fuel across the board. You have to remember, I didn't touch the leak down on the barrel valve. So we're getting the same amount of fuel that's traveling through that little slot in here and feeding this part of the system. Now, with the same amount of fuel, if we create a place to leak part of that fuel here, we're going to lose some volume of fuel up here. So by losing volume of fuel up here, where the theory is all of my fuel is traveling to the back of the blower and the manifold, we're losing fuel in the back 4 cylinders. So that brought the temperature up in the back 4 cylinders and took the temperature down in the front 4 cylinders. And it really balanced stuff out really pretty well. I did notice that the front 2 cylinders were still the hottest across the board. I mean, as far as comparing all cylinders, the front 2 were still the hottest cylinders. So I went ahead and I took the 15 thousandths dribbler nozzles out. I'd intended to go to 16 thousandths, but I just went ahead and made a little bit bigger change just to see if, you know, how big a difference that makes. Say, had I gone from a 15 to a 16, I might not have noticed much difference. So I, you know, in testing and in theory, I went ahead and jumped straight up to an 18 thousandths. Left the 14 here, went from 15 to 18 on both front cylinders, and noticed a difference again. And at that point, we actually ended up very close to even across the board with the second cylinder back on each side. So that would be number 2 on that side and number 6 on this side, actually being the warmer 2 cylinders out of all 8. So the theory works, everything works on that part. I'm really pretty happy with how that turned out. So once that was done, we had to take it for a drive and see what the rest of the system is doing. See if I get anything on video, I guess.
boy.
All right, so after a quick test drive, I'm really pretty happy with the changes that were made, but I did notice a couple of things right off the bat. So first of all, the idle temperature is maybe just a touch warm yet. It is balanced out and more even across the board, which I'm really happy with. But on the pyrometer, it's still up there about mid 800s. It could be a little cooler than that. Also, I noticed that at a cruise RPM, you come out just off idle and you start making temperature pretty quickly. I'm just trying to roll down the road and it wants to go up there about 1,000 or 1,100 degrees. Now, I know I'm not going to load the family up in this thing and go take them to dinner. We're not going to be cruising Main Street with this truck. However, I don't want to be going out there and doing intros at a monster truck show, or even if it was going to stay a mud truck, I wouldn't want to be driving from camp out to the mud hole and have 1,000 degrees, 1,100 degrees on the pyrometer. Now, what do I think the fix for this is again, the barrel valve. So if you remember, I never made a change in my leak down setting. I never made any change with the barrel valve yet. We just moved fuel around with the fuel that we already had. Now, we took the fuel that was making these 4 cylinders across the back really cold and just moved it to where it leaked into the front cylinders that were really hot. Now it's balanced out. And if you remember at the end of the last video, I had mentioned that this thing was leaking down fairly lean to get it to clean up these back pipes. So I think what I need to do is richen this up just a touch. Get those temperatures, the idle temperatures, get them from that mid 800, almost 900 degrees, down to something more manageable, maybe 600, 650, 700. Have to see what it does without getting too rich. I think we can richen some up there. Now, I had mentioned before that this is basically just for your idle. And technically it is. That is just your idle mixture. But if we go over here and look at my spare spool, and we take a look at this slot in the spool, if I have this thing at a idle mixture that is fairly lean right off the bat, we're only using, say, like that much of the spool, that much of the slot. It does not take very much movement on the butterflies and this spool here to get into your cruise RPM. So say we start here with this much slot showing and we just crack it open that much to go cruise down the road. Now my butterflies are open a little bit, the blower's moving more air, and we're not increasing the size of that slot by a whole bunch. So maybe it's just leaning the entire engine just a little bit too much because we don't have enough slot there. If I richen up the barrel valve and cool those initial temperatures off right off the bat, now we're using this much of the slot. And as I roll open in that just off idle cruise position in the throttle, now we're getting into the window portion and maybe getting enough fuel to maybe almost get a little bit fat in the cruise range. I have to play with that a bit yet. There is another option that if that doesn't work, I could actually come in here with my Dremel tool and modify our slot here just a little bit at a time, and see if I can't play with that and make that intermediate circuit, we'll call it, work just a little bit better. We're really splitting hairs at that point, but I think it's worth playing around with. And then the last thing that I noticed in our quick little drive, you could tell towards the end of the video I had kind of jumped on the throttle a little bit, lined out on the street out in front of the shop here, squeezed on the throttle. You saw the pyro immediately go red. So I have the pyrometer set up in this truck to where it starts showing a red warning at 1,100 degrees. And probably the danger zone is close to 1,200, maybe a little over 1,200. As you can see, I've got it on memory right here. We were tickling 1200 on a couple of the holes. And all that's telling me is I need to decrease the size of my main pill, return less fuel to the tank and put more fuel in the engine. So that is actually the next step for me to do. Richen up the barrel valve just a touch, put a little bit smaller pill in it. It's got a 135 pill in it now. I think I'll just jump down to a 120, try and get back to the fat side, get back to the rich side where it's safer, and tune from there. I don't know if I'm going to do very much technical tuning or really try and play with it too much until I get my 12-port block so that I can clean that up and make sure that that isn't going to make any difference. Really, it should not make any difference in the tune-up, but I don't want to start chasing my tail for no reason if I don't have to. Well, I'm going to go ahead and finish off this video here. I've reached the end of my last day off. Fortunately, I was able to receive my 12-port distribution block, get that installed to clean up this mess back here. Everything turned out pretty well. I did fire it up again today, played with the barrel valve a little bit. I was not able to richen it up as much as I was hoping to get a little bit more fuel off idle. So it looks like I might end up filing on that other spool a little bit and see if I can gain something there. But that's going to have to wait until next day's off. If the weather's good, I might take it out and see if I can make a couple good pulls on it. See how it reacts to that smaller main pill that I've put in it. Until then, thanks for watching. Have a good one. Nope, it runs.
It runs.